STRATFOR Intelligence's George Freeman explains the political and economic and moral crisis that occurred from the fall of Lehman Brothers to the end of 2011, and I will give my comment at the end after he has given his excellent explanation of the crisis.
Another of those roller coaster weeks on the stock markets may terrify the wits out of investors, but it belies sensible analysis of the world's political economy. Just consider this. Did anything really happen on Thursday to make Apple, America's most valuable company, worth $36 more than the day before? A more penetrating look at the very slow recovery of the world's largest economy points to systemic failure by the financial and political elites. I'm Colin Chapman, and welcome again to Agenda with George Friedman. George, your article on political economy this week was described by a very independent and respected broadcaster as the most cogent review of the current predicament she's read. Can you put the last 3 years in perspective?
When you think about the problem of the system, it's certainly an economic crisis, and it's also a political crisis. But you really can't think about these as separate problems. These are problems that are intimately linked. In 2008, one segment of the economic system failed. That was the financial system. That's a subset of the economic system. In its failure, you had both the financial problem, but also the political problem. The financial elite lost all credibility. As a result of the failure of the financial elite, the political system came in to stabilize it and to preserve the system as a whole. And so you wound up with the political system coming in, the political elite coming in and overwhelming the financial elite that had failed. In so doing, however, the political elite also lost a great deal of credibility. They lost credibility because they had, in responding to the financial crisis, seemingly destabilized the entire system by spending both far too much money and failing to basically discipline the financial system by holding those who did it responsible. Now, we can go to an infinite regress about why the financial system failed, and there are many who would argue that the failure of the financial system really was rooted in the political decisions that were made about the cost of money, and so on. But these two systems are constantly interacting, as are in some countries the military system and so on. And what we have seen here is a dramatic situation in which first the financial system and its elite lost credibility, and then the political system went into gridlock and the political elite lost credibility, until we have, in all major countries of the world, the United States, China, the EU, until you have a general systemic problem. It's not that it's not soluble in many of these countries, but you see it in a destabilization going on beneath the surface. In fact, the riots in London are kind of symptomatic of this, of the fact that some elements of society have lost such respect for the elites that they're prepared to take extreme action.
Some people, particularly the young, see themselves as victims of actions by those who don't seem to be suffering any pain. In fact, those who fail pass the pain to the populace.
Well, I think there's a kind of model you could argue that people are deprived of things, so they'll revolt. But it's much deeper than that. Because normally, just because you cut benefits, you don't have these kind of riots. And many of these rioters were not rioting because they were planning to go to university and weren't going to get an opportunity to do so. You had a great deal of criminality in this. And that criminality is interesting because when criminality starts to look legitimate to large numbers of people, that's when you have a social crisis. I think it's a mistake to look at what happened in London simply in terms of, well, there were social cuts and so there was a rising. That rising couldn't have occurred if the elites themselves hadn't appeared to be so corrupted, so compromised, and even one could say so incompetent. That was the real issue that we faced there. And I think if you simply say that, look, if you do social cuts, people will riot, well, that's not empirically true. It's when you wind up in a situation where you no longer know who's in charge, nor do you care, that opportunities are created for the criminal class. Far more interesting than the rioters have been the people in England, some of whom have justified the riots. I'm not saying that as a moral category, justified or not. What's interesting is that it is not a universal condemnation.
Yes, and in Britain you've had scores of politicians exposed for major expense fiddling. You've had solid evidence of a once proud police force bribed by the Murdoch tabloids. And in the United States you've seen congressmen bickering and point scoring while, to use a cliche, Rome burns. And in China, widespread corruption. The political classes are not exactly heroic.
Well, I agree that it's fed up with the system, but I really don't think that politicians fiddling with their expense accounts is a definitive thing. They always do. You really have to distinguish between the constant comings and goings of the system and the silliness of Rupert Murdoch, who turns out to be in the end a very silly man in many ways. You have to not look at that. You have to look at the more fundamental issue. People who were supposed to be experts in finance did unexcusably stupid things and also in the process profited handsomely. People in the political system who were supposed to hold these people accountable and prevent them from doing these things failed to do it. I think in most countries we expect our politicians to steal a little money here and there on expense accounts. We expect bickering in Congress. We expect these things. But when the fundamental thing that legitimizes an elite, the financial elite's ability to manage money prudently, is violated in two ways. First, that they clearly can't do it. And secondly, that they profit from it anyway. And the politician's obligation to stabilize the system and not let people get away with this, that doesn't happen. You have serious problems. So I think the problem really starts with the systemic failure of two major elites, not on minor things, not on trivial corruption, but on the fundamental thing they were hired for. And the fact that they don't seem to regard themselves as particularly having failed. I mean, this is what creates a crisis, I think.